Hello, welcome to video number 18 in our series Microsoft Certified Professional Developer 4.0 with ASP.NET and C#. The content exam focus is 70-515 and the content is owned and created by Ravi Nanganuri, Microsoft MVP. .NET Videos.net. So video number 18, we're going to talk about WCF, or Windows Communication Foundation. This is one of the exam fundamentals for 70-515. In the previous video, we went over basic web services. Windows Communication Foundation came out in .NET 3.0. It is now .NET 4.0, and there's been productivity enhancements, support for things like REST, this type of stuff built into the 4.0 framework. WCF is Microsoft's initiative for building service-oriented applications. It's quite a large topic. You can build WCF services as reusable DLLs, or they can live directly into your projects. You want to see our next video series around building service applications, which covers another exam for more depth on WCF, but we'll cover some fundamentals in this video. So WCF is basically a framework for building these services, and there are some basic pieces of the anatomy you need to know about. So we're going to be building services first of all, and those services are going to have endpoints that we're going to expose, and they're going to live in certain environments, or we're going to host those in certain environments, as we'll talk about. There's several options. The main takeaway initially with WCF you should be aware of is just the flexibility, a huge amount of flexibility the way we build these. Now, endpoints themselves are going to have what's called the ABCs of WCF, the address or the where the service is going to be, the binding or the how the service is going to be hosted, and then the contract, what we're actually going to expose to the world. So ABC, or address binding contract, is how Microsoft describes the endpoints themselves. And you'll see that we can configure a variety of options here, whether it's going to travel over TCP, exposed with SSL or without SSL, and then what messaging we're going to expose. We can expose everything from complex types to just integers to simple messages to much more complicated services. So hosting WCF services, once again, lots of options here. We can host these in everything from console apps. Doesn't have to just be IIS. We can host these right out of Windows services, something called Windows Activation Service, WPF applications, etc. So kind of the theme initially as you dive into WCF is just to understand it's a framework with lots of flexibility, lots of options, and it's meant to have a lot of configuration type options for you as you build these flexible services. So I'm going to create a new WCF service application, which is one of the templates that we have here. I could also be creating a library if we plan to reuse this. I'm going to go ahead and just create a service application. I'll simply call this .NET Videos, and I'll give this name Demo Services. So the idea here is, in the previous video we went over web services. So there's similar functionality here for sure, but a lot more flexibility, a lot more options. Notice by default with this project template I get this interface called iService, and then I actually get this service class here where we actually implement the interface methods themselves. So let's talk about looking at this method, this public string get data, this very simple method that it's exposed by default for me. And up here at the top, again, that's defined in this interface. Up here, what's something called the operation contract, which basically defines, what we are going to expose to the world. What are our clients going to consume? What methods are going to be available here? So similar to like web methods we did in the previous web services video. And if we want to add new functionality, which we'll look at in a minute, we'll add it in the interface as well as in the class itself. Fairly straightforward, simple web config file. Not as much noise here now with this particular project type. Notice this is on the service side again. So we have some basic settings here that we get out of the box. Are we enabling HTTP GET, etc.? So that's much. We could dive into that in our next video series that are all about services. Notice that I'm going to implement a new method or a new piece of functionality that I want to expose to the world here. What I'm going to have to do is create what's called an operation contract. And this is on the interface itself now. I'm going to create a little calculator method here I call add numbers. And I'll pass a few parameters this time into the service. So we'll have this int x, int y. So a basic signature here. We're not implementing the actual core functionality because it is an interface. See our previous video on Visual Studio 2008 Novice to Professional for more information about interfaces and object-oriented programming. Notice that when I come over here to the actual class where the services functionality lives, and that we're going to expose to the world. At this point, once you've defined that new operation contract and that interface and you go to build this, you're going to get the error down here that basically says, hey, you have to implement this method. The interface is, again, a contract. The interface is making us implement this method. So what we're going to do, which is an OOP technique, what we're going to do is go ahead and implement the actual functionality for that calculator method here. So I'm going to go ahead and do an int add numbers, and again I'll put the signature here, and then I need to put the nuts and bolts or the meat here for what I want this calculator method to do. I'm just simply going to take a few parameters, x and y, and just return x plus y for now. That's good enough. And then notice now that will compile just fine. If I go ahead and build that, then of course the error here will be gone. Now you see the build succeeds at the bottom here. We actually implemented the interface. Now note, I could have right clicked as well and had some automation help in the form of Visual Studio, such as implement the interface itself. You get this implement interface. Again, see the previous video series, Visual Studio 2008 Novice to Professional, for more depth about interfaces and OOP techniques in general. I'm going to go ahead and run the service, and you see this tool pops up. It's the WCF test client. So at this point I have a service library or a service application, but I get the benefits of this WCF test client just built directly in, so I can invoke my services and test them. I don't have to have a test application. We'll look at how a client can consume in a minute, but notice I can pass the parameter values here at this point, and I can just click the invoke button and then make sure that my service is behaving or operating as I expect it will. And I can look at the actual XML that comes back. I can look at, I passed the 22 and the 23 there. Here's how the XML looks, as well as the formatted response. This WCF test client tool, there's not a lot to it. It's very straightforward. You have just a very few amount of options here. I could add additional services. Notice I could look at the actual config file for the client DLL itself that would be using that basic HTTP binding. We look at when we create a client application to consume this service here in a moment. You can certainly do that, and that's what you're going to have, but you have this WCF test client built underneath the scenes for you by default, so you don't have to. So if you look at the, I'm going to go ahead and add a new website to consume this service. I'll add it to the same solution. Again, obviously lots of different types of .NET applications can consume services. Doesn't have to be a web application. Doesn't have to be a website for sure. Could be a web application project. Could be a Windows application, a WPF application, Silverlight. So lots of different types of application can consume these very flexible services from WCF. We'll keep it simple here. I'm going to create a website. I'm going to actually fast forward a bit. I've just added a button, a couple text boxes. I can pass those parameters across to the service, and then a label where I can display the result. This is going to be very similar as if you're referencing web services as it is with WCF. Now, in previous versions, you may have use the tool service util. You can certainly right click and just add a service reference, and it will go ahead and wire things up for us. I'll go ahead and you can see I can discover the service if it's there. I could punch the URL in. Now this service that we're hosting does not have to be hosted. Now you might be in IIS again. WCF service could be hosted a lot of different ways. Many of the .NET or the Microsoft applications they build, such as Team Foundation Server with Team Build, for example, has that Windows service hosted via, in WCF, hosted in a Windows service. Notice when we look at the client application itself here that actually, I created the reference to the service. I have what's called this basic HTTP binding. There are several bindings available. The binding again describes how we're going to host it. Are we going to have to support SSL? Are we going to have to support client credentials? Are we going to use a certificate, for example? Are the various settings about max buffer size? Are we going to allow cookies? The important thing to notice about WCF, so flexible, very configuration type driven, and you could host the same service with the same functionality with lots of different endpoints and bindings. So you could have one service hosted with TCP and also hosted maybe over HTTP at the same time. So depending on who the consumers and the clients are, they can both have access to that service. So I'm going to go ahead and on the button process click here. Very similarly to the way you would reference a web service, I'm just going to instantiate an object of the proxy, if you will, and then I'm just going to punch into the label, the actual result label, the text I'm just going to pass in, and I'll fast forward a bit here as I call the add method a couple integers, whatever was typed in the text box. So we just return the calculator values here. So if you're familiar already with working with other types of services such as ASMX web services, this is straightforward type syntax. There's no magic here, and we can simply run this at this point, and I have a web application making a call to our Windows or our WCF service via my button click here. Punch a couple values in. Simply click that, and there, of course, is the values coming back there. We're getting the addition. No problem. Now we could obviously be passing much more complicated data types back than that. We may have a data set or data table coming back that was on the service side pulled from a database somewhere, etc. One of the powerful things to remember about WCF is the idea that you have a lot of flexibility in the way you host the stuff. You see that I have some functionality here, add numbers. If this was to change over on the service side, so let's say I just changed the implementation by adding Y twice there, I simply rebuild the service side. I'm not going to update the service reference at all. I'm just going to punch in click the button, and you notice that I'm adding that Y now twice. 22 plus 100 does not equal 122, it's 222 now. The service changes in the background. I get the new functionality automatically by default here. I don't need to update service reference, so to speak. So again, similar to the way if you worked with other services in the past, that's some of the value there and the power there. So I encourage you to take the exam summary at the end of this video, and we'll explore WCF in much more depth in our next coming video series.